Wow. Have I got a guess for you, my friends? We are going to be mixing anthropology with woke culture. Let's just get into it, shall we? Professor Elizabeth, how are you?
I'm doing fine. Thank you very much for having me on.
You're more than welcome. I'm going to have to ask you right off the bat what that plant is behind you. It looks like the one they make tequila out of.
It is a succulent, but I don't know exactly which plant it is. We are now, Nick and I are in a rental apartment for a year in New York City. So it's not actually my picture. It was up, hanging up when we got here.
Wow. And I should say for our friends at home, uh, Elizabeth is Professor of Anthropology at San Jose State University. We're here to talk about, friends, amongst not just the subject of anthropology and our history, which is just fascinates me so much, but also I think this will be interest to a lot of people. The kind of woke culture that has pervaded society, coming from the university system, that or stemming from it. I spent 5.5 years in university, and at the end, everyone hated me. They were just like, "Chris, can you just shut up and let us get our degree? We don't want to know what's going on in the world." And it was all fine, but I think, Elizabeth, I left uni just knowing more about the world than the lecturers. They get entrenched in these positions where they're happy just to keep scrolling out the same spiel, the same lecture notes, the same and all that critical awareness, which was why we went to uni, was to become critical, reflective thinkers. All got shelved. So that's fascinating. And the last thing, I just wanted to say hello to your wonderful husband, Nick Pope, who's Nick. You probably heard his name, folks. UFO expert. I did a wonderful podcast. I'll just show you the picture for it. We called it the Real Life X Files. There you go. It's that one there, folks. If I can remember, I'll put a link below this video. So, dun dun dun. Elizabeth, I'm not even sure where to start. You very kindly sent me some notes. Gosh, it almost this is the problem with all this woke. People call it woke nonsense, but it's way more serious than that. It's just it's a cretinous destruction of our intellect as human beings to tell us that men are women now and women are men, and you're not allowed to argue with it. And I think Jordan Peterson epitomizes falling foul of having a bit of intelligence. It seems a crime that we're going to talk about that when I'd really like to talk about your actual job. so
Okay.
so so we'll mix both. Do you want to give us an outline for people at home that won't know what being a professor of anthropology is exactly?
Absolutely. I'm a professor of physical anthropology, sometimes also called biological anthropology, and my area of specialty or expertise is on bones. So I look at the bones of mainly past peoples and mainly prehistoric people. Not always, but mainly. And what that means is I look at skeletal remains of people who were alive before they could record what happened to them, so before written language. And for most of my career, I did this in California at San Jose State University. where I curated, so I took care of one of the largest single site collections west of the Mississippi. So it was a collection of prehistoric California Native American remains that were all before contact with Europeans. And basically, this collection spanned about 2,000 years and contained over 300 individuals. And what I did with this collection was not only did I take care of it, but I also researched it and ensured that others could come and research it. I had scholars from Ireland come, from the UK come, from all over the US to look at this fascinating collection. And what makes it so fascinating is that it's really complete. So for those of you who don't know, that we have about 206 bones in our body, and many of the individuals had all of their bones, or maybe 90% of their bones, like even the little toe bones. And why that's important is that the more complete the remains are, the better and more accurate you can reconstruct their lives. So some of the things I looked at was like, you know, what did people die of? So I looked at infection rates, or I looked at, you know, how hard was their life? What rates of arthritis or joint disease did they have, and what pattern was that? And I also looked at things like single individuals who were unique. So for example, one of the last studies that I conducted on this skeletal collection before I was locked out of it, which we'll of course get to much later, or a little later, I should say, is this skull, beautiful skull, that had this huge bump on its head about the size of a golf ball. And at first we thought this might be a tumor. My co-author and I thought this might be a tumor, but we took an x-ray of it and we noticed that there was a hairline fracture on the back of this skull, on this bump. And therefore it was actually related to trauma. And if you looked at this collection, you noticed that how many individuals actually had trauma, like broken noses, arrowheads embedded into the bone. And looking at it, then we noticed that this trauma occurred mainly at a specific time in the 2,000 years that showed signs of invasion. So it wasn't just one population, but populations switching over and fighting over this land. And of course, the land was beautiful land. It was California, and so I had lots of resources and high population density because of those resources. All prehistoric, all pre-contact. And so by looking at skeletal remains, we can basically reconstruct past people's lives, giving past populations a voice that they would not have whether if we didn't do this.
Let's go down, as much as I hate to do this, because if this was just my chat, which it sort of is, I'd want to go straight into the human element or the historical element. But at what point in your career did it start to become problematic with respect to the faculty?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I started at San Jose State University in 2004. And prior to that, I was at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, which is like the equivalent to the Smithsonian in Canada, right? And I was, and throughout my whole career, basically from the time I graduated with my, even I would say even before, from the time I was a graduate student to till now, I always felt that reburying bones that had been already excavated was going to ruin the science, because basically the bones are the data, and so if you rebury them, you don't have data. And so I was always against this reburial movement that we have in the US. We have it also in Australia and New Zealand and Canada, where their modern tribes make claims on ancient remains to rebury them. And sometimes the links are very tenuous. Like, for example, some of the oldest Americans, like what we call the Paleo Indians, have been reburied by tribes. For example, the Kennewick man is probably the most famous at around 9,000 years old, was buried by a modern tribe. There's very tenuous links there. This is like saying I would like to bury Otzi the Iceman because I'm from Europe, right? And Otzi's only 5,300 years old, but nevertheless, I had been always vocal about my concerns about reburial, and it wasn't a problem. I wrote about it, and it wasn't a problem. My university had no problem with it. They didn't agree with me, but it was not an issue. Nevertheless, things changed around 2020. So I wrote a book that I co-authored with an attorney, James W. Springer, called Repatriation and Erasing the Past. Repatriation is the act of returning skeletal remains and artifacts to modern tribes. And so we wrote a book saying that this is problematic, that repatriation is problematic, and highlighting why it is from the legal case standpoint, but also from the academic or scholarly case. We're losing data. But what else happens is that when people fear losing the skeletal remains, they self-censor because they don't want to offend the tribes that are trying to make claims. And they start doing weird things like accepting creation myths that the Native American tribes and modern Native American tribes or Canadian Native American tribes are arguing for. And they'll start using terms like two-spirit, arguing sometimes that skeletons cannot be sexed, but also worrying about the use of really regular words like maybe cranium can be considered offensive because, or talking about individuals because these are people, not individuals. So strange stuff like that is happening. And it's all being kind of led, and I know this sounds kind of like a conspiracy theory, but by this kind of postmodern movement where they don't accept that there's anything such as fact, and that really the important thing to the postmodernist is who tells the story, not whether it's true or not. And they split the world into the oppressed and the oppressors. So we see this in the repatriation movement, where the Native Americans are considered the oppressed, and therefore what they say, no matter how absurd it is, becomes accepted. And if a scientist tries to challenge that, they're considered oppressors. But we also see this in all sorts of movements in the university. Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this in relationship to also the non-binary sex issue. And anthropologists actually were key in supporting that. And actually, I would say it probably has its roots in anthropology, something that anthropologists should be embarrassed about. But basically, in the non-binary sex issue, where people are claiming that males can be females and females can be males and everything in between, those who don't fit the normal positions of male, female, or man, woman are considered the victims. And those who insist that biological sex is real and binary are the oppressors or the victimizers. And so again, it doesn't matter whether it is true or not, it matters the narrative. And so this really kind of took hold in the public realm at around 2020. And that's when my book came out too. And so what happened with repatriation and erasing the past is that there was a huge backlash against it, with about 1,000 academics trying to get the book pulled from the publisher. And since that time, 2020, I've been on the receiving end of cancel culture attacks till now, which ended up in the cancellation of one of my talks for the Society of American Archaeology that argued that any repatriation claims should be based on science, not fiction, not religious tales of creation, and that, and then again, I was canceled by the American Anthropological Association because I was going to give a talk, and I think the talk's title was "Sex is Binary." Yeah, and I think I can't remember exactly how I put it, but it basically like skeleton. When you're looking at skeletons, you can only see whether it's male or female. You're not looking for this spectrum. You're looking at a biological factor, male or female, and so that got canceled. And I decided to write a book about all these issues and about the cancellation.
Did you get flack for holding the skull?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. One of the big cancel culture attacks that I encountered was when I posted a tweet that said, "I'm so happy to be back with old friends." And in that tweet, I posted a picture with me holding a skull in the curation facility. So the curation facility is where we store and take care of the skeletal remains. As curator, I was back in there after something like 10 months of being kept away due to COVID, what I would call hysteria, that kept us out of the university. And when we finally were allowed back in, I was so glad to be back. And, I loved my job. I love working with skeletal remains. I love trying to reconstruct the past. And so I was taking care of these remains, doing some of my duties. And I just thought, I'm just going to take a picture and show my joy at being back. And I had many pictures like this taken before, some by the university photographer. They used photos like this for promotion. It's almost, a picture like this is almost like a picture of a medical doctor with a stethoscope. That's how common it was. But I think because of my position, it was attacked as I was being disrespectful. They claimed that I should have been wearing gloves. It's interesting that this whole issue about gloves came up as a part of being disrespectful, when actually the National Park Service, which is one of the biggest employees of archaeologists in the US, says that you shouldn't wear gloves because you increase the likelihood of dropping it. Now, there are some times when you wear gloves. If I was a forensic anthropologist looking at a murder case, of course I would wear gloves, no doubt about it. If I was the first one ever to touch these remains and they were like, oh, we're going to do gloves from the beginning to preserve as much of the DNA as possible, that's another story. But the skeletal remains that I curate, or that I curated, I should say, had been excavated in the 60s. They had been handled by hundreds of people, likely, at the very least dozens. And any DNA that would be taken from them would be taken from like the inside of a tooth. So they pull a tooth, they cut it in half, and they scrape the dentin out. That's how they take the DNA, or from the mastoid in the skull. So there was no reason for me to wear gloves. And most anthropologists don't wear gloves when handling remains like this. But it became like she should have worn gloves because that's respectful. Ironically, they even changed the protocols to argue that, they changed the protocols to handling the remains after they kicked me out of the curation facility. The university kicked me out of the curation facility. And the new protocols not only require people to wear gloves, if the glove is ripped, you have to change it, but they also require people to wear masks. Why? Like it's absurd. But this caused a huge backlash. And I think that had I not been for the for the study of remains and had been for the reburial of remains, I don't think that this picture would have caused nearly as much, or maybe any backlash. But it is a picture that kind of captured people's imaginations, but also led my university to start retaliating against me in earnest and literally changing the locks on the curation facility so I could no longer go in there.
I'm guessing they don't know about the Skull and Bones Society.
Right.
With their, for friends at home, Skull and Bones is the Yale kind of esoteric, Masonic, like, I don't know what you guys call it over there, but
I think we'd call it Masonic as well. Yeah.
yeah, it's basically where all your Bush family and their history have converged on this club called Skull and Bones. And if you look at the prime minister, the presidents going back over the years, many of them have been what they call bonesmen. Basically, kind of, corporate control central, corporate psychopath control central, and of course the thing they're famous for, they're called Skull and Bones, but they have allegedly the skull of Geronimo.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure that's true, but I've heard that they do allegedly have that.
And I bet they don't put gloves on when they handle him. So
I doubt it.
yes, there is an issue here, because we are denying the actual science that we're trying to uphold. I mean, for example, it's from a spiritual perspective, it's really important to understand when you're looking at the universe and that there is a yin and a yang. There's not a yin, a yang, and like there's a yin yang in the middle that's just disagree with the science, and it doesn't. It's kind of like an important concept in which to ground yourself when you're. I mean, the alpha and the omega, the male and the female. It's an important thing. Life is a union of these two things. To say it sort of doesn't work like that is, in order to kowtow and conform, is a bit silly, huh?
And I would say, when we're looking at sex and considering, what is, male and female, and people are trying to deny that. If humans didn't know the difference between males and females for as long as we've been around, we wouldn't be such a populous species, right? Of course, I think that I separate as an anthropologist, I separate the difference between sex and gender. And gender is actually like the expression of masculinity and femininity. And so, I don't think that, anthropologists are doing that anymore. What they're doing is they're combining gender and sex, and they're making the argument that it's all on a spectrum. And it's not. I wouldn't even say that gender is really on a spectrum. I would just say that it's your expression of male masculinity and femininity, and it's oftentimes cultural, and it nearly always aligns with your sex. So you can think of certain examples where there are exceptions, like in India, the males who dress up as females. This is a long tradition, and but it's interesting that these people are oftentimes looked down upon in their culture. Not that I think that they should be, but that it is considered, even where it's kind of a long-held tradition or a long-held variant of the gender, it's still kind of looked on as abnormal. What I think anthropologists are trying to do is they're trying to combine gender and sex. And then they're using basically what I would say is a few fallacies to support that. So one of the things is, if you look at a skeleton, you can tell the difference between a male and female. And I can teach anybody pretty much what the difference is, and how to identify difference between male and female. Now, that doesn't mean that we're always perfect at it, because sometimes you don't have the whole skeleton. Sometimes some people are better at it than others. But for the most part, if you have the whole skeleton, we're nearly 100%. It's about as good as you can get. But anthropologists they are picking up a couple things that are what I would consider fallacies. One is they're saying, because there is no ideal, then it's on a spectrum. Well, we know that there's no ideal in anything. There's not a perfect rose either, but we wouldn't say, well, that's halfway between, a rose and a daisy, right? So I think that mistaking the ideal or the perfect from from normal variation is a big mistake. And so you get these weird terms like obstetric bodies, bodies that can bear children, as opposed to a woman or a female. So that's one of the problems. Then another problem is that they're using what are commonly called disorders of sexual development, like individuals who have the wrong set of the 23rd chromosome, like a XYY or a X without a comparable one, or XXY, and they're saying that's evidence of that sex is not binary. But this is not true. It's just a congenital disease, so birth defect. And we wouldn't say, for example, just because somebody has sometimes 6 fingers, we wouldn't say the normal hand has 6 fingers. And to support that, we know that these individuals who have these congenital birth defects almost always are infertile. And so they can't have children normally. So that shows that it's also a disease. But when you look at the skeleton, we can look, sometimes some of these diseases will leave their markers on bones. And so we can see, oh, this individual was a male, but had Klinefelter syndrome, or was, had a syndrome that caused this. So we can see that when it's pathological. This is not a gender spectrum. This is just a pathology, a disease. And then the other thing is, sometimes in archaeology, they get themselves tied up with thinking that if the artifacts aren't matching up to what the bones are, that this means that the individual was trans in their life. So if you find a female with what they consider male artifacts, that maybe this female was actually a male or presented herself as a male. Well, this is basically making a fallacy to assume that the culture had the same ideas about burial and had the same ideas about activity patterns or sexual division of labor. And there are so many artifacts that can be male or female. And even now, if you think about sewing, we might think of a seamstress as, find a needle, like a nice bone needle, and you think, oh, this is like a female artifact. It's a seamstress. But we also have tailors. And so why wouldn't we just assume that, well, maybe in this culture, sewing was not associated with a specific sex, like it's not now. So I think that they're getting themselves wrapped up in that. And the reason why they're making these mistakes is because they're so bent on trying to determine ways to prove that sex is non-binary that they're forgetting that, artifacts vary from culture to culture, but sex does not.
Yes. And an item found at burial we have no idea what context it's buried in, have we? It could be, you know, an item of a sewing kit could represent something in astrology,
Right.
or it could be a good luck charm. Or yes, is there Elizabeth? Is there? I mean, I'm guessing the handing back or the repatriation of these collections. I mean, first off, an awful lot of work has gone into putting that collection together. I mean, we're talking thousands
Yes.
upon thousands of people hours. In addition, there's also, we don't know what technology we're going to have in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years that could shed an awful lot more light on the information contained therein. Is that your sort of take on it?
Yeah, I would say that those are two takes. So basically, one thing is that skeletal collections are extremely hard to come by for the most part in the Americas, and most of the collections that are now curated in our museums and our universities are actually what we call salvage sites. They're collections that were excavated because of progress, like building a road. And we in Greece, this happened with the building of the underground, the metro. You know, yeah, there was so many archaeological sites that had to be excavated. There's only two options in those kinds of cases. You either, bulldoze over the stuff and learn nothing, or you excavate them and try to reconstruct the past. So that's one of the things. It's like, it's not that these were necessarily excavated to unbury them, but rather to save them from being destroyed. Interestingly, almost all of the very oldest remains were found this way in the U.S. So, like remains dating 7,000 to 12,000 years old, and many of these weren't buried. They were individuals who died, and they ended up there, and just over time were buried naturally, but it wasn't necessarily a funerary burial. Not all cultures had funerary burials. It's wrong to assume that they did. For example, in Europe with the bog bodies, there were basically in these Bronze Age period, basically two types of ways to deal with the dead. One was cremation, and two was to throw them in the bog. Nobody was engaging in burial, right, as we would consider it. So that's one issue. And even the bog bodies, a lot of them were discovered when they were digging peat for fuel, right? So, um, but the other issue is that once these are excavated, it's very difficult to find who they're related to. So we're really giving them to just any tribe that's close by. The collections where there was a clear link, like there's historical documentation and there's clear biological link and so forth, have already been repatriated. So the remains that we have kept over the last 20 years since the repatriation and reburial laws have passed are actually those that are not connected with modern tribes through science. So how do they collect them now is they use the Native American creation myths and religious tales to make the connection, not science. But, you make a very good point about, changes in scientific progress. When Kennewick Man, as I mentioned earlier, was discovered in 1996, they tried to do DNA studies on him and they couldn't get any DNA. The technique wasn't good enough yet. 10 years later, they were able to test his DNA. Unfortunately, what happened with Kennewick Man is that the DNA was tested. He was found most closely related to Indians of South America, not North America. And Kennewick Man was found in Washington State. Washington is one of our most west north states in the US. So it's, very close to the Canadian border. But yet he was closely related to South American remains. And yet, because there was a small link to a tribe in the Northwest, they buried Kennewick Man. But there would be a link to almost any people, because we're all related. It really has to be who is most closely related. And so that's one of the sad things, is that they're now, even though the information is getting better, they're misrepresenting what it means.
Elizabeth, I want to move on to the actual anthropological stuff. But it's going to be me that sounds like the conspiracy theorist now. But, I'm, and anyone on my channel knows this, I'm a great believer. There's an agenda pushing all of this. There's an agenda to dumb down society through the Hollywood, through the music industry. It also gets pretty dark. We've just had the Eurovision Song Contest, which used to be a beautiful affair. I'm sure Nick's told you about it. It used to be, what wonderful folk songs, and people were happy. Now it's just a satanic. It's literally like a satanic ritual. The whole thing, and then it's my belief that there's a network, and they over the years, and we're talking centuries and centuries here, have infiltrated everything. And the university system is a prime example. I just wondered if you have any thoughts on that, if when you're facing this barrage of alienation, does it come from, obviously there's a lot of naive, gullible, brainwashed people out there. That's just people. But are you able to see who's pushing this agenda down on them?
It's very difficult to know exactly when these kinds of issues arose. And I do think the postmodern movement played a huge role. And you could say that this was pushing an agenda. And as I said, the agenda of, the splitting people into two groups, the victims and the victimizers. But I think that there's also an anti-West kind of factor in here, where, a lot of people think that the woke movement is anti-religion. I actually don't think it's anti-religion. I actually think that it's more anti-West. And the reason why I would say that is because what I've experienced is that many of the people who are very set against me and are very religious, but they would be very much against like Christianity. Mainstream Christianity, I should say. I'm not religious at all. I'm an atheist. And so I don't know my Bible very well, But what I noticed was when I first entered into the university and entered into anthropology, I thought that people were critical of religion overall, like I am. And yet I do think that religious freedom is very important. And I would never go into somebody's church and try to convince them, to leave their faith or their beliefs. So I do think that, you have to live and let live, and you have to respect different arenas. So I don't want people to come into the lab and try to get me to pray to a God or any God. But I'm also not planning on making any tours into the churches, right? But what I noticed is that actually it was more like anti-West and anti-mainstream. So religion was perfectly acceptable if it came from Native Americans, if it came from Arab, so Islam, Um, but it didn't seem to be okay if it came from mainstream Christianity. And so um, it was kind of eye-opening to see this. And I couldn't quite understand how this kind of embrace of these other religions happened. But I remember quite clearly early on in my career um, that one of my colleagues took me aside and said something to the effect of, um, and she was very, very liberal, very progressive liberal feminist. And she took me aside and said something to the extent of, um, you know, if I had a daughter, I wouldn't want her running around in these tight clothing and mini skirts like our students do. I would rather have her wear a hijab. And I thought, what a strange thing for a feminist to say. And I told her, I said, well, if I had a daughter, I would want her to be able to wear whatever she wanted and not be attacked for that. But so it is for me, it is the anti-Western aspect of postmodernism that is embracing all sorts of strange beliefs as opposed to being anti-religion altogether.
Elizabeth, let's move on. I'm fascinated to know. See, I watched a documentary on the Neanderthals the other day. I like this sort of, I'm and then they're suddenly saying that Neanderthals existed. You might correct me on this, but I think they quoted 130,000 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, You see, I wonder if there's a real missing element, the real missing link to our existence, because if we go down the line of evolution, which I think there's evidence to suggest. I know it's not a complete theory in a lot of people's eyes, but I certainly believe that rather than we were maybe created 4,000 years ago or some of the other beliefs. But the incredible, I'm just going to say, genetic mutations that have helped the survival of those that can adapt to the situation the best, which has created things like the human eyeball, which I fail to believe that has been created in such a short amount of time. You hear the history of humans quoted in terms of, I don't know how long Homo sapien has been around, but I would have thought it would be millions upon millions of years of slow progression and possibly civilizations being wiped out, maybe a few people left to start again, or entirely wiped out. And I just find it really, when you hear people like Yuval Harari, I probably got his name
Mm-hmm.
wrong, and he's saying, we came out of the African bowl 80,000 years ago. I'm like, whoa, hang on. 80,000 years ago, we would have looked pretty much like this. It's at the time of Jesus, or 2,000 years ago, people just looked the same as us. That was 2,000. You could extrapolate that from that 10,000, we probably pretty much look the same as this as well. And then 80,000 is nothing. Yeah, we might have had a few more hairs coming out of our ears or our chest, or perhaps, but the notion that we were sort of, not much more than hairy apes, 80,000. I really struggle with it, Elizabeth, and I'd love.
Okay. So I do. You are correct. 80,000 years ago, we pretty much were like we are now. We were probably a little more muscular, a little shorter, right? Um, and Neanderthals, 130,000 years sounds right. 130,000 to like, I don't know, I can't remember the end of Neanderthals, but I think it was like 50,000 or so. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether Neanderthals were the same species as us in a subspecies or whether they were a separate species. And there's DNA evidence that suggests that maybe we did interbreed with them, but then there's other evidence that suggests not, and the debate is still raging, right? So nobody's 100% sure. But let's look at when we first split from the apes, right? So that's really, we shared what we say is we shared a common ancestor with the African apes. Now they've been changing as well, so it's not those apes that but it's kind of like if you look at a family tree, where the split comes. That probably was somewhere between 5 and 7 million years. So at about 7 million years, we looked like apes. And if you look at like modern apes, they do share a lot of similarities with us. I mean, there's definitely, they look more like us than like, let's say, dogs, right? But nevertheless, if you go back and back, you can see that the further back you go, the less we look like the animals that have split from us before, but that everything has been evolving. So the modern chimp is not the chimp from 4 million years ago either, but that it does oftentimes take a long time for these changes to occur. At 3 million years ago, 3.5 million years ago, we had like the Australopithecines, which were like the Lucy type of humans. And they were upright, they could walk on two legs, but they were practically like chimps, practically. Their brains were already bigger than modern chimps, but their brains were about a third of the size of ours. So the brain size has increased by 3 times, I guess is a better way of putting it. So we go from about 3.5 to about 2.5 million, and then we get the first in the genus Homo habilis. And Homo habilis is a little bit more like us. So smaller teeth, a little bit bigger brain, not a huge brain, but like about half our size, and a little bit more body proportions like us. So the arms a little shorter, for example. They think that this might be when we first started eating meat on a regular basis. And I think the earliest evidence of butchered animal remains dates back to 2.5 million years. Wow. Then we get to Homo erectus at about 1 million years, 1.5 million years. And let me add in a little caveat. There's a lot of debate when each of these species begins. So some people, you'll sometimes see Homo erectus being described as starting around 2 million years and sometimes 1.5. So there is debate still. And part of the reason why there's so much uncertainty is because it's really hard to find a 2 million year old fossil, right, of human or a human ancestor. So it's, we weren't everywhere. We were just in Africa for the first 3 million years of our evolution. But we get the first movement out of Africa at around 1.8 million years. So we don't know exactly who led to who, but we have a lot of possibilities. So if we think Homo erectus then led to archaic humans, so archaic humans would include Neanderthals, then we could say that we basically began a slow evolution into Homo sapiens at around 1 million. But some people argue that there were a whole bunch of other species in between, like Homo erectus, and then Homo heidelbergensis, and Homo antecessor, and so all these different species that are slowly moving towards us, and that Homo sapiens only make their appearance about 100,000 years. But it's not like, this is a long evolution. It's just that when you think about what a species is, usually you consider a species biologically who can breed with who and have viable offspring. But we can't do that in species who are no longer in existence. So it has been a long time since the split from African apes that enabled us to finally get to where we are at. But about 80,000 years, I would say you're correct. We did look pretty much like we do.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for clearing that up. Okay. Next one.
Yeah.
I've been dipping in and out of this purely because the arena I'm in, podcasting and trying to be contemporary, means you've got to get a basic grasp of this sort of stuff. And I'm talking now about the link between, and I'm going to say I have a completely different take on this. I think scripture is allegorical. I think it's a code. I don't think you read it literally, but when we're talking about things like the Book of Enoch, and they're talking about the Anunnaki and etc. and etc. I've heard the theory that human beings were tampered with, I think is a good word, and that at some point in our evolution or our historical past, I can't really think of a different way to put it. Our DNA was fiddled with. Some people say that there's evidence of that still that you can find in us, and it was done by beings from extraterrestrials, I'm going to say. Can you shed some light on what I'm trying to say and then give us your take on it, Elizabeth?
So I have heard these theories. I have not seen any good evidence for them. Now, of course, we do have DNA from other organisms that have entered, and like bacteria and viruses, and sometimes they become incorporated into our own DNA. Not only humans, but other animals have the same thing. And so one example is that there's been a fairly good evidence, for example, that the mitochondria in our cells, which has its own DNA, mitochondrial DNA, was actually a virus or a bacteria that entered into us at some point in our evolution, and therefore becomes a part of us. And we do see this kind of symbiosis, and it shouldn't surprise us. If you look at our gut, it's full of living bacteria, right? And so I don't think that this is very surprising. I personally don't believe in extraterrestrial DNA entering into us. I could be wrong, of course, but I don't believe it. Now, Nick, of course, has been looking at UFOs and the unexplained for much of his career, I should say, not most of it, but much of it. And he'll let you, if you ever talk to him about it, he'll let you know he's married to a complete skeptic. So I am very skeptical. I'm also always open-minded. So if I'm proved wrong, that's okay too. But, some of it is based on issues around various kind of unique skulls or unique treatment of skulls, like the elongated skulls. And I think that this is just a modification that was adapted by various cultures. One of the interesting things is that there's some trends that seem to have popped up in multiple cultures independently, and we don't know why this is. I don't think that that aliens is the explanation, but I do think that there is an explanation, and maybe we'll get to it and maybe we won't. Who knows? I have offered to take a look at these skulls and look at also brain size, because one of the arguments has been that some of these individuals had far larger brain sizes, but because of how the shape and size are so intricately related that it's hard to determine brain size by just looking at something. You actually have to take a measurement, like, for example, with BB pellets or dried grain to get a volume. And I'm always open-minded about these things, but so far I haven't seen anything that makes me think, oh yes, this is a smoking gun on the issue.
So let's come on then to, is there any archaeological evidence of giants once roaming this great earth?
There's no evidence I know of giants. There are some hoax photos that were actually initially created as a competition for the best hoax photos. But there are some groups obviously much taller than others, and there are some pathologies that lead to gigantism. And you can tell when it's real because if these individuals are larger than average, then they're not just a normal sized person bigger, right? Because then for example, then the leg bones wouldn't be able to hold the top body, it snap. That's why, like, if you look at an elephant, their leg bones are so much bigger than you would expect them for the animal's size because of that weight. So there's what we call allometry, different shapes for different sizes. And so there might be certain populations that had these pathologies or this gigantism, but it wouldn't be like what you're seeing when you look at giants on the internet. These are very particular pathologies. I do know that some populations had when they become very isolated, they sometimes have like dwarfisms too, so that you get very small individuals, and then if there's a lot of interbreeding, like on an island, you might get a whole group of dwarfs, and this might help explain certain early humans like Homo floresiensis that was found in the Isle of Flores. And we have this concept in evolutionary biology called island dwarfism, which means that animals who are large tend to get small because of limited resources. But we also have island gigantism, where animals who are small to medium get larger sometimes when there's no predators. And that's where you get like things like the Komodo dragon, right? Most places lizards are about 12 inches, and these islands, they're like 12 feet.
Wow. What about the elongated skulls? What is all that about?
Yeah, so like I was saying, the elongated skulls we know that they are created, so basically wrapped or boarded. And we know this because we have mummies that show sometimes still the wrappings or the boards. What we don't know is why this was adopted in so many different cultures. And so we have, cranial modification in one of the earliest cases is in Australia at about 20,000 years ago with cow swamp skull. But then you also have it in Peru, and you have it in various very northern places like British Columbia. So we don't know why it spread, or if it was adopted independently. I don't think that it was alien influence, but I don't know the reason why so many people adopted this kind of change in a similar way, and these people were very unrelated. So how it spread is still a mystery.
What about the mud fossil thing? This has gained massive interest on the internet, and it's how can I say? A lot of these sort of theories that pop up, they are utterly fascinating, and you can see why people believe in them. I'm a little bit more like yourself. I think sometimes when we jump on something, it says more about us than it does about the science.
Yeah, I've seen a little bit about the mud mummies, but I don't have a real good sense about them. I don't I can't tell I can't tell what's going on there, quite honestly. I'd have to throw up my hands in the air and say, I'm gonna wait for more.
Yeah, friends at home, if you're wondering what we're talking about, there's interested parties out there that for example, have suggested that the Sphinx at Giza, the Great Pyramids, was actually an animal that got buried in mud during a huge mudslide I don't, as you can tell, I'm not doing this justice. I don't pretend I know a lot about it, or maybe during a volcano, maybe a big ash cloud came down or something. But that these quite rare sort of animals and human giants and stuff get it's just fascinating. I'm not
And
doing.
it and it is fascinating in some ways also because you think why what led people to come up with these fascinating animals. And I would say one thing is, the human imagination is amazing, and so some of this is just going to be humans' imaginations, and that in of itself is fascinating. But we do know that there are animals that were once in existence who are now extinct. Giant sloths were on the island, some of the islands, um, and giant sloth-like monkeys were on Madagascar before humans got there and basically hunted them to extinction. So we don't have those animals anymore, but it's kind of fascinating to think that of the animals that once roamed the earth and who are now extinct. But extinction um, it shouldn't be surprising to us.
Um, Lost my train of thought. What was I going to say? Yes. Okay, so final thing, Elizabeth, it's been
Okay.
absolutely wonderful chat. I've got such a good job. I used to blooming check test tubes in a factory. I used to have to pick up a test tube. If it had a bubble in it, it got thrown in the bin. There was nothing wrong with it. It's just aesthetically, the company didn't want to put test tubes with this. It was like some kind of serum for the medical world. If it had a bubble, you threw it. It was all, literally the most soul destroying job I've ever had. I used to look at people doing that, and they'd been there for years and years and years, just doing that all day long. And I'm not criticizing these wonderful people.
Of
I'm
course.
I'm just saying, bloody hell, it was so boring. Now I get to chat to anthropologists, professors of universities, and and ask all the questions that I'm fascinated with. The last one has got to be, I'm just going to go to I keep looking across, by the way, folks, because I got 3 screens going on here. I'm not being rude to my guest. I'm trying to get up some interesting pictures on the internet. I'm now showing the Sphinx and one of the Great Pyramids. I know this is slightly veering into archaeological territory, but do you have any views on who built the pyramids, how old they actually are?
So I did spend a year living in Egypt. And so I've been to the pyramids many times. And I used to teach a mummies course. And I took lots of Egyptology. I do think that the dates are pretty much accurate. So several thousand years, not hundreds of thousands. Um, I think that there's clear evidence that it took a massive amount of people to make these, but not anything extraterrestrial. Ancient Egyptians had slaves. They called them speaking tools, and I'm sure that these were part of the workforce to build the pyramids. It's also interesting that the Great Pyramids of Giza get so much attention, but we have their protocols at Saqqara are the step pyramids. So the first pyramids were less dramatic, smaller, but you could see that there was technological advance. And if it hadn't been just human ingenuity, then we wouldn't see this kind of technological progress from a more basic pyramid to a fancier one. So I do think that that's good evidence that it was humans who built them. Um, and, you know, absolutely fascinating to visit them, and to visit Cairo in of itself. One of the interesting things I found was the modern day Egyptians, who are Arabs, of course, for the most part. There are also Bedouins and Coptic Christians, and Cairo is a very diverse place. They take a lot of pride in their archaeology, and they take a lot of pride in their mummies. And I think this is a great thing about their culture, is that this pride, and I hope they don't change that. I hope they continue to promote the study and tourism of their ancient civilization, of the ancient people, and that's one of the beautiful things about that area of the world.
The thing that intrigued me when I was in Egypt, which is a long time ago now, about 1992, I think. So I would guessing it's probably changed a lot now, Cairo. But
I was there in '95, so not.
Back then, it was the real Indiana Jones experience. You didn't know what was gonna happen, and
Yeah.
I walked into a hotel, and I walked up to the reception desk, and I said to the girl behind it, right, I'd like to see the pyramids, please. You know, how is that possible? And I had this vision that she was going to say, well, sir, you know, you're going to need to get camels, and you need to kit them out. You'll need water for 10 days in the desert. And, you know, you're probably going to lose a few people on the way. And she looked at me and went, they're there.
Yes,
And
yes.
I turned.
People don't realize.
I looked across the car park, and there's the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Oh, right. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yes, people don't realize how close to Cairo that Giza is. And that's one of the amazing things as well, is that they are so accessible. But I took a whole, like a sunrise to sunset camel ride on to go to all the pyramids of the region, even the older ones, who are less fantastical, but still important to see that progress.
Absolutely. I was a young Marine, and there were about 7 of us Marines, and for some reason we ended up on horses going to the pyramids, and one of them was blind in one eye, and so it did that thing where it got nervous if someone came up on its blind side, and that was me on my horse, and it turned around with these filthy, disgusting teeth in a city which back then was filthy and disgusting. I smelt things in Cairo that I don't ever want to smell again. And yeah, that horse took a big chunk out of me.
Wow, yeah.
Elizabeth, fascinating chat. I've been showing, as we've been talking, a copy of your book, On the Warpath, My Battles with Indians, Pretendians and Woke Warriors. Many congratulations. I've written a few books. It's no mean feat to write one. Have you? Is this your first book, or have you?
No, it's actually, I think it's my fourth, maybe. Um, but this one is written for a popular audience, so it's not a textbook. It's not anybody can read it and enjoy it. I cover my career, but I also cover some of the problems in universities today, and of course, the woke culture. Um, I try to I try to keep my sense of humor, which is something that I've tried to do throughout this whole time. And Nick was very kind to proofread it, although any errors that are still in there are my fault.
And how's it been received?
It's just coming out now. I I'm hoping that it'll be received well. I haven't seen any reviews yet because it's literally just come out yesterday or so. Um, but I see that it is selling well on Amazon, so that's good news. And I am very hopeful that it will be read by a lot of individuals, and not just academics. This is a book for those just interested in these topics, and those people who are, kind of worried or curious about how we got so off rail and not just enjoying the fascinating field of anthropology, but turning it into something that's just a politically correct, pile, where you're not allowed to say anything. So this is really for those who are for those who love anthropology and for those who are concerned about saving it, regardless of whether you're, an academic or just anthropology is so fascinating. It reaches so many people. And so even for those lay people, I've tried to make a real effort to reach as many people as I can.
And I'm sure you will, and I wish you all the best of it. Elizabeth, it's been, I'll say it again, absolutely fascinating chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely welcome, and I hope you'll come back on the show and let us know how the book's done, and we'll cover a few more subjects.
Yes,
Please.
And Nick sends his regards.
Yes, give my best. Give my best to Nick. Please do. Stay on the line, Elizabeth, so I can thank you properly after I hit the record off. I'm just going to play us out. Friends, I hope you've enjoyed this chat as much as I have. If you could like and subscribe, that would be absolutely wonderful. I will put links for Elizabeth's socials and the book below in the description. So go and grab yourselves a copy. Let me know what you think. Quick one, just a big thank you to everyone who sponsored my Atlantic row, which will be taking place in December. I'm rowing the Atlantic to show that there's a life after mental health issues, folks. If you can chuck a fiver in the pot, as you can see many kind people have, I'd really appreciate it. We're going to be supporting service kids who've lost a parent, which 40% of our military kids lose a parent to suicide, or 40% of the deaths, I should say, are by suicide. This is tragic, and we're going to be getting homeless veterans back into housing and back into training. So there's also a link below. And that just leaves me to thank you at home. Thank you ever so much for tuning in. Much love to all of you. Look after yourself, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.